Well, thank you for joining us for the second of our kind of retool podcast. We're still very much in our beta phase, so we're still learning. Thank you for all the feedback we had from the first version of this. It was very well received, and we're trying to fold that into to what we're working. So last time we had myself and Alan online. This time I've got myself and Dan. So rather than being South America to UK, we've got the far west of the UK versus the far east of the UK online at the second on the line here. So same format as last time, 3 topics, 30 minutes. We'll jump straight into the first topic, and it's straight by one that Dan wanted. First topic, Dan, why on earth are there 300 IDP vendors? Do we need them all? Why are there so many? Tell me.
I get that question on a daily basis. Every time I talk to an IDP startup, which is probably once a week, there's so many of them out there, they start off by with a pitch deck, right? And they've always got a market slide. I just had this happen again on Tuesday. And the market slide says, and there are about 50 competitors worldwide. And I stop them right there and I say, have you actually looked at our report? And sadly, some of them haven't.
That's always very flattering when that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, pitch for the report. By the way, you can get these numbers free because I decided to publish all the good stuff for free, right? But anyway, what happens is that most companies, even some of the big ones that I've talked to recently, have no idea how many software companies are actually doing a product that they call IDP. Mm-hmm. Now, it's our job, of course, right, to determine whether it is IDP or not. Yeah. And of course, in my report, we put together a list of sort of standard functions that one would expect in an IDP workflow. Matt, my background, I've been doing stuff in the IDP market for 20 years. I built these products. So we put together a pretty standard list and we can spot them, right? So when I first went after this, first thing I got to say is it says 400 plus companies on that report. That turned out to be wrong. And I can explain that. We were working off a list that we had put together about 6 months before the report. I have had time to go through that list again this year, and what we found out is that there were several companies on the original list that were actually system integrators or VARs, right. Or they were companies that were doubling up. So it was a company selling, say, Hyperscience or selling Inferred or selling Kofax, and they had doubled up. Yeah. And they hadn't done anything. They hadn't added any value. It wasn't their product, right? So we decided to take those off. And the list I'm working on today has currently 307. Right. Fairly verified, because I am actually going through, that's what I do in my spare time, right? And looking these up, verifying them against our list. And I think at the end of it, probably take me another few weeks to finish this up. At the end of it, I think we'll probably end up with a solid about 300 vendors. Now, these vendors range from startups that don't have a customer yet, but they have a website and they have a product and they can show it to you, to the oldest legacy companies like Kofax have been around for 30 years. So it's a huge variety out there. Now, why do we have so many, to your question, right?
Yes.
I'm not sure we have enough.
Because my question was going to be looking at this and saying, well, there's 300 vendors. There's a $4 billion market by 2026. That's a lot of niches or a lot of attrition. What's it likely to be?
Yeah. So it's going to be both, Matt. And the reason why I said I'm starting to come around to the view that maybe we don't have enough is as I look deeply into each of these products and these vendors and what they're doing, the typical story for a startup is this. We had a project that a customer asked us to do. Yeah. And we tried all the OCR engines and all the IDP AI stuff, and it just couldn't do the job on these particular set of documents. Now, some of that is regional. Some of it is languages. So there's a number of people, probably over 100 companies in our list that you could probably say that's regional, that's local, right? And that got me thinking yesterday that one of the reasons why we have so many IDP software companies is because IDP is not like Word. It's not a horizontal application that every single person in the world can sit down, and 90% of us within an hour can bang out a document and print it and send it out or whatever we do with it, and we get a gold star for it. And an IDP is the process of attempting to teach computers to read every variation of business documents imaginable in every region in the world. And up until recently, probably the last 3 or 4 years, this was very hard to do. I worked for companies where we had to constantly come up with new models all the time because whenever we saw a new document that we'd never seen before. Now with what Google did, and this is where the explosion came from, the reason why we have 300 now and we only had 100 about 5 years ago.
So it's the transformer model made it all of a sudden accessible to be able to build these things at a cost that's...
You nailed it, yeah. Two things, OCR using AI got so much better with NLP. And the second thing is computer vision, right? So now the computer can actually read the image without having to OCR it first and say, oh, I think that's a layout of an invoice. That's a huge step forward from the past, right? So now the computer is on its way to being able to read documents without first being trained as to what that type was. That's the first thing, right? So that was a huge step. However, we're not quite there yet. We're getting closer. Things like large language models are certainly going to have an impact. I'm publishing a piece today on the latest announcements about GPT features in IDP. And you'll see in that, Matt, that there's a lot of talk in there about using GPT in the data validation stage to say, hey, you know, that doesn't match up with these other documents that I've already looked at. So that must not be, or it must be, right? Because GPT, say what you want about it, but it does a really good job at something we call named entity recognition, NER. It does pairs wonderfully, addresses, dates, things like that, which again, we've had to work really hard in the past to do an IDP. So again, why do we have so many? Two reasons. One is the explosion from the Google Transformer revolution, and suddenly any group of college students sitting in the dormitory could say, and I'll give you an example of a couple people who actually did this. There's a company that their mothers, these two guys, the founders, their mothers were both accountants, bookkeepers actually, and they spent their days taking receipts from the people in the company for travel and sitting there and having to input those manually into the accounting system so they could do the travel expenses. And so these two bright people went out and got all the latest stuff. This is about 2017, 2018. And they built a really good receipt reading and data extraction product. And we covered it a couple weeks ago. So I run across these stories all the time where it's almost like, you know, the Zuckerberg story, right? The guys in their dorm room, we've heard the story over and over again. So that's the reason for the explosion in companies. The second reason, to go back again, is there's such a huge diversity and variety in the types of document formats and layouts coming that we're just now starting to see computers become good at it. So let me put it another way. Up until GPT, I think computers were sort of like, it was like teaching a 6-year-old. Now I think we've actually pushed it up to maybe preteen now. So you can see what I'm saying. The computer is starting to get to the point where it can recognize things without having to sample all these documents first. It just recognizes it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things across the board, because out of the box capabilities are able to be what I used to call NLP, was kind of able to gist stuff. So to get enough of it, it allows you to approach workloads that economically you couldn't touch before. They weren't important or lucrative enough to invest in building product, but now you could have a go at them because, hey, maybe 80% is good enough, maybe 70% out of the box is good enough to solve enough of the business problems and move on. So perhaps that's actually not going to improve your problem with the explosion of vendors. That's actually going to make your job harder, right?
My job?
Yes.
Well, it certainly keeps me busy. And, you know, back to the thing about a $4 billion market, it certainly has the potential to become that. But the other fact that I think we're going to see over the next 2 years, Matt, is there's going to be attrition. The attrition is happening in two ways. One is, the first one is obvious. There are some startups that just aren't going to make it, or they're going to morph into sort of another AI services sort of thing and leave the IDP behind. The second thing is, and this is, we haven't seen this start yet, is the acquisition phase.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem that we've got is there's a lot of these startups that got a lot of funding, and we published that in the report as well. It's the most investment that's ever been put into the IDP space in the 30 years that I've been involved in it, by far, over the past 3 years.
And that's a perfect time to move on to our next topic. One, because I think that's a really salient data point, and let's not give too many data points away for free. We want people to buy some research at the end of the day. But to move on to the second topic, and this isn't specific to my research or specific to your research, but something that you know, I think we find when we're researching this is that topics come up through repetition from speaking to companies, and you're like, well, that's actually not relevant to the research I'm writing, but that in itself is kind of interesting. You talk to a lot of startups, and I talk to a lot of startups, both you know, globally. I mean, certainly for the work intelligence, we were talking to people from just south of the Arctic Circle to Australasia to South America and all places in between. And we started to see certain commonalities. I wrote an analyst note a week or two ago about one or two of the things that came up, and it wasn't meant to be, hey, US startups do this and European startups do that, but looking at some of the commonalities that we can start to kind of group those together. And I kind of, in this report, made a little bit of a joke that I'm talking to a startup in North America. I'm much more likely to see a set of logos, a NASCAR slide, a logo soup, however you want to call them, which talks about the companies that the founders have worked at before. They're ex-Google, they're ex-Facebook, they're ex-Stripe, right? If I was doing the same in Europe, I may well be seeing, hey, here are our research papers. Here are the academic pieces of research that we've done. And whereas that's not entirely the same, and I think we can probably come to some of the areas which, even within the European continent, those are a little bit different. I guess ultimately the way I start to look at that is very much about the way in which money is raised in these different places. So taking Europe as an example, and Europe, of course, as I always point out to people, is not a country. It is a very large continent with a lot of moving parts, and you'll find very different things in the Nordics and in Germany to what you'll find in Iberia, for argument's sake. And we all speak to vendors in all those countries. Is that regional governmental funding, so European Union and regional startup funds, are really important as sources of startup money, particularly in the southern half of Europe.
Yeah, I agree.
Starting up in Spain, Italy, Portugal, the Balearics, so that whole area, the fact you might raise €500,000 or €1 million in real startup money from the EU is significantly important. And that kind of regional money doesn't seem to either exist or be an important source for our North American comparatives. Do you see some similar things in your discussions?
Yes, I do. In my background, I was a founder of a software company. We raised money. And I've also worked on the other side of mergers and acquisitions. We went out and bought software companies. So I've been around the startup world for a long time. I've been involved in venture capital fundraising. And most recently, I was working with a CEO of a Dutch-based company. And he had a software product, and he was looking to raise some money. And the first thing I noticed when we put his business plan together was what you said. He was already getting funding from a Dutch government setup, which I hadn't really seen the likes of in the US. And as a US startup, I sure would have liked to have that source. I don't remember seeing anything like that. And I don't know if it's the same in Europe. Maybe you can help me on this. In the United States, we have this thing where the universities have collaborations with corporations.
Yeah, kind of incubation units, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that colors a lot of what happens for funding in the States. Is the government stays out of it because there's such a vibrant sort of, I don't want to say free market and get myself in trouble, but a less regulated, perhaps, money market in the U.S. And so I would have loved, though, to have the opportunity to go to the state of Colorado where we were at and say, hey, guys, can you give us $1 million? We'll create 25 jobs. It didn't exist back then. So I completely agree with you. That's one of the differences I see as well.
Yeah, and I have in my past worked at a university incubation product units 20 years ago in the UK, and where I now subsequently see what we needed. We had the initial small amount of capital to see us through the first couple of years. What we didn't have was the first clue about what to do next. There was no further involvement. So one of the upsides of taking money, these smaller amounts of money from regional funds, is they're quite hands-off with you.
Yes.
The bad side is they're quite hands-off with you. So you lack what you would get from a more commercial investor, which is they'll push you, they'll bring their expertise. They'll also look at other parts of their portfolio and say, actually, these guys over here could help. Maybe you could help these guys over here, which again, maybe isn't what you think you need, but often is what you actually need. So between the two, there is a little bit of difference. And I guess where you do see intervention funding in North America is much later, which is, hey, you want to build a factory in my state? Well, we can do a deal on the lands if you're going to spend so many billions of dollars to build your distribution or your data center. So later on, those expansion funds, where I guess, without wanting to get into politics, politically you can say, hey, we've done this and it's brought a number of jobs to this county or to this state.
Yes, it does. In the US, it's actually not a party issue. It's every politician, no matter what party they are. Well, we do have a very tiny Green Party in the United States. They wouldn't agree with me, but the two big parties, they're both crowing about how many jobs they bought because of direct investment into that state or that city. So you're right. I was thinking the other difference, Matt, and I think this is important, is between the U.S. and European countries, is in the U.S. and the chairman of the board is not an executive. The chairman of the board is there for governance purposes, as a mentor, advisor, help with the business wherever he can, but he's not an executive. He doesn't really, he or she, sorry about that, they hardly are involved in the operations. The CEO is the power in the US. What I noticed over in European companies, UK companies, is the managing director, the CEO, is running the operations, but the chairman of the board is very involved, almost as an executive sometimes. And I think that that's important too. It's useful because you've got this person on your board that comes from the industry, has all the contacts, and from the very beginning, you can have that sort of guiding hand that you were talking about was missing from the funding side.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a yin and yang thing going on there. Where in the States, you rarely see that. Boards are almost advisory, and then a couple investors, and all they care about really is, how are we going to get some money out of it? And so in many ways, I like the European model where the board is very much involved in business, whether it does well or not.
Yeah, I think something else, I mean, we need to move on to our third topic in a few moments, but something else that was kind of interesting was that interesting to some new developmental models. And what I mean by that is we're all very familiar in Europe and in North America with offshore development being done in South Asia. What I was interested in the first time I met a vendor who was wholly focused on the US market and run out of Silicon Valley, whose R&D was done in London, which was a first to me. Also a number of UK companies whose development and R&D was in Colombia. So South America as a startup, I'm actually folding a little bit back into the discussion that Alan and I were having last time about how important Brazil is globally as a powerhouse for IT. I'd never come across so many companies that were using the obviously highly skilled developmental workforce in Colombia and also in Peru as a development center for European startups. That was new to me. It's something I want to make sure I ask more questions. One of the things I found from doing this research was actually all the way through, I'm thinking, oh, that's actually some really interesting attributes to my vendor list. I wish I'd started that at the beginning. And some of those things about whether domiciled, I've got in my head, but I haven't actually got the numbers to say, oh, how many people have got offshore sites in Ukraine or Colombia or Peru or Bangalore, just so I can have a raw number. So I guess whenever we iterate through our research for the following year, it's always good attribute to add new tricky geographic attributes to our output.
Well, hey, it closes. Maybe the next time you can have a topic about Asia. It's a whole different continent.
Well, absolutely, yes.
South America.
Absolutely. So the third topic to get on today, and this will be the one that might stress my stopwatch, which unfortunately I have actually started for this one. I'm not going to guess it last time.
Yeah, no worries.
Topic of this could be what we refer to as a zombie piece of information or a zombie fact that stalks the earth and can't be killed. So 80% of data is unstructured. Is it? Is it really? Is it really, Dan?
Yeah, go to that next slide. So I actually did this slide for a couple VC pitches for companies that were going to go solve the unstructured data problem. And I was using that 80% unstructured data number as if it was gospel. I did a little digging, and what I found out is that it's a great mystery. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm not picking on any of these companies. I just grabbed a handful of examples that I've come across in the last couple months on this, where we've got some very reliable, reputable sources here that are putting up headlines and talking about 80% of unstructured data, and people making bold statements. Like in this particular one here, I've outlined, we know that 80 to 90% of the world's data is unstructured, as if we all know, right?
Yeah.
Go to the next one. And by the way, that URL that I had on the last slide, you don't have to go back there, but that URL goes to a white paper that has nothing to do with 80% unstructured data. Just
and so here's another added in at the press release stage rather than the research.
Yeah. And here's another one here. This is a reputable AI software company, and they're just blabbing on about the power of unstructured data. And as per Gartner, unstructured data is about 80% of this volume, right? And then there's the source, the paper down at the bottom. It has nothing to do about unstructured data. It's about a completely different way of looking at data. So I picked a couple really obvious examples, but this has come up so many times across the industry. In the 25 or so years that I've been hanging out in the ECM industry, which is now called content services or content management, this number has been used by everybody. So here's what I found out real briefly, and then we'll get on to the does it matter or not, right?
Okay.
First of all, apparently there was an IBM marketing paper back in the 1990s. I cannot find it, but it's cited by a couple people that were writing about this around 2001, 2002. And they're citing this IBM paper, but I can't find it. I went into the Wayback Machine and I couldn't find it, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have a lot of time to go research, and nobody's paying for my investigative journalism. So I'm not going to dig any deeper than that, but it's questionable, right? And what about Gartner? Gartner has, to my knowledge, or anybody I've talked to, has never actually done a study that says there's 80% of the data is unstructured. So they picked it up, I think, at some point. But if you go to Gartner's website and look for 80%, it doesn't exist there. This is a myth that has been propagated. And the reason why it matters from a business standpoint is there are companies who are raising money using these slides. And some of them have actually raised money on the proposition that there's this huge 80%, 175 zettabytes by 2026.
So is this a zombie? Is this a zombie for which we are all, to all our benefit, to preserve its life, or was it going to be better if we finally put an end to it?
Well, to quote one of my favorite songs, Hotel California, they stabbed it with their steely knife, but they just can't kill the beast, right? It's a useful idiot sort of a thing, right? Because it makes it sound like there's a reason why all these businesses need to exist to solve this problem. But the funny thing is nobody actually can solve this problem. It's unsolvable. It's like enterprise content management. Nobody can actually do that with one product. It's impossible, right? As you know, it's about 25 different disciplines, projects, everything, right, to do that. But we got people out there saying we can solve your unstructured data problem and control the 80%. So I'm looking at it first from a, how does it affect the market and the business that we work in? And should we actually be using that information if it's so desperately unsourceable? That's my beef. Yeah.
So thinking about this, this is predicated on the basis that this unstructured data is already electronic or not. Because if we're talking about warehouses full of paper or libraries full of books, well, maybe that's how, I don't know quite how we quantify that. To my mind, and something that you and I have discussed before, the moment that something becomes electronic, that infers on it a structure. So once something's electronic, it is not unstructured any longer. Exactly. The moment that something has file data associated, file naming structures, size of the document, date of the document, where you're structuring where you're filing the document, where that document file sits, all of that infers structure, which is absolutely useful. So the idea that something is purely unstructured, as soon as you end up with bytes in a file, it has structure. Or maybe I'm being a bit too purist about it.
No, you're not. Alan and I both agree. We've talked about this as well. And so a PDF, we were talking about this yesterday a bit. A PDF is inherently a very structured file. It's not just the content, it's also the metadata about it. It gives you more information. You can extract the text. So it's very useful as a file container. But that's not where this comes. To understand unstructured data, one has to go into the database world. And what in that world, what it means is that every piece of data that's in a database in rows and columns is structured.
Yes.
Everything that's not in there is unstructured. Does that help frame the conversation? Yeah.
So it's less about structure and it's more about shape. So the fact that there's a uniformity of shape within a database is one of the things that's nice about databases, right? You have a nice set of rows and columns and everything's the same. It has the same number of dimensions.
Yeah, but it's more about accessibility and usability of the data, because if I've got 1,000 PDFs, yes, each one is structured, but it's not in rows and columns. So it's real difficult for me to do a query against those 1,000 PDFs. That's what we mean by unstructured data. Even though it doesn't make sense logically from what we said, if you have to sit in the data warehouse world mindset to understand what unstructured data really means, in my opinion, Matt.
So maybe we could take a less controversial view and say that 80% of the world's PDFs are restaurant menus in our phone that we're never going to look at again. That's maybe a less controversial way of looking at it. Yeah,
I agree with you. There's this idea of dark data that's being marketed around for quite a while, and there's a reason why most of it is dark, because it doesn't deserve to have the light shown on it. It's not worth the wattage, right? But another thing too that I want to try to get in before we end here is that even if we took a purely sort of, let's be data guys and say just data storage, digital data storage, right? An average PDF with an image in it is going to be about 1 megabyte size, right? Now, if you just took the data out of that, what would be the size of that file? It would be an ASCII text file. It'd be like 10K, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
So if you use that and you say, wait a second, the structured data, it only takes up this much of the storage. So it's probably more like 99% of the digital files are unstructured and 1% of the data is structured. And this is what we were kicking around. Maybe we need to start something new and just flip this on its head. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, well, this is part back to, I went through a phase of shouting death to documents a long time ago. We love the containers so much. We love the container often much more than like the contents. We're like the kid who throws the toy away and plays with the box, because we like the management of the boxes more than we care about the contents of them. That's more of a philosophical point, and maybe we'll return to another occasion. We are actually up at 29 minutes of our 30 minutes. We've done really well on timing. Dan, thank you ever so much. For those of you who sat through all 3 topics, that's awesome. That's great. Thank you so much. Next time, we'll have another 30 minutes and another 3 topics. And we appreciate the time stopping by. Thank you ever so much.
Cheers.